She had everything: wealth, luxury, and a husband who provided her with a life most people could only dream of. But beneath the surface of her perfect world, something was deeply missing. In the shadows of her lavish mansion, she found herself drawn to someone unexpected, someone who made her feel alive again. A young, striking man who wasn't supposed to mean anything more than just an employee. What started as harmless glances turned into stolen moments that neither of them could resist. But this wasn't just an affair. It was a ticking time bomb, one that would shatter everything when the truth came out. And when her husband discovered the betrayal, no one could have imagined how he would react. What happened next left everyone speechless. This is a story of passion, betrayal, and consequences that will change the lives of everyone involved forever. What would you do if everything you knew was built on a lie? She had everything, except what she desired most. Margaret Sinclair's perfectly manicured fingers traced the rim of her crystal wine glass, the $500 Cabernet Sauvignon within barely touched. The expansive living room of her Hamptons mansion stretched before her, a testament to the wealth she and her husband, Robert, had amassed over their 30-year marriage. Priceless artwork adorned the walls, and the plush carpets muffled even the slightest sound. Yet the silence was deafening. The antique grandfather clock in the corner, a family heirloom passed down through generations, ticked away relentlessly. Each second that passed felt like a reminder of the years slipping through her fingers. Margaret's gaze drifted to the ornate mantelpiece, where a collection of photographs chronicled a life that now felt like a distant dream. Her eyes lingered on one particular image, their wedding day. Margaret, radiant in white, looked up adoringly at Robert. His arm was wrapped protectively around her waist, his smile as bright as the summer sun that had blessed their beachfront ceremony. The memory of that day hit her like a physical blow, constricting her chest and bringing unexpected tears to her eyes. "Where did we go wrong, Robert?" she whispered to the empty room, her voice barely audible over the ceaseless ticking of the clock. The Margaret in that photo was full of hope, drunk on love and the promise of a future filled with shared dreams. Now, at 55, she felt like a ghost haunting the halls of her own life. Robert, consumed by his ever-expanding business empire, was more often in boardrooms and on red-eye flights than he was at home. When he did return, he was a stranger, distant, distracted, his mind always on the next deal, the next acquisition. A sudden gust of wind rattled the French doors leading to the terrace, startling Margaret from her reverie. She rose, her silk robe whispering against her skin, and moved to close them properly. As she reached for the handle, her reflection in the glass gave her pause. The woman staring back at her was undeniably beautiful, her ash-blonde hair expertly styled, her skin still smooth thanks to the best treatments money could buy. But her hazel eyes, once sparkling with life and laughter, now seemed dull, almost lifeless. The corners of her mouth, even in repose, turned slightly downward, as if the weight of her loneliness was physically manifesting itself. "Mrs. Sinclair?" A young, male voice called from the foyer, causing Margaret to jump. She quickly wiped away a stray tear and composed herself. "In here, Jason," she replied, clearing her throat to mask the emotion in her voice. Jason Parker, the Sinclairs' newly hired property manager, appeared in the doorway. At 28, he was the picture of youthful vigor, tall, with sandy brown hair and warm green eyes that seemed to light up the room. He carried a vase filled with a stunning arrangement of peonies, Margaret's favorite. "I thought these might brighten up the place," Jason said, his smile genuine and kind. "The gardens are really coming along nicely." Margaret felt a flutter in her chest, a sensation so foreign it almost made her gasp. When was the last time anyone had done something thoughtful for her, without being asked or paid to do so? That's very kind of you, Jason," she managed, a small but genuine smile tugging at her lips. "They're beautiful." As Jason set the vase down on a nearby table, their eyes met. In that brief moment, Margaret felt seen, truly seen, for the first time in years. It wasn't just attraction, though Jason was undeniably handsome. It was the way he looked at her with genuine interest, as if what she had to say actually mattered. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Sinclair?" Jason asked, his brow furrowing with concern. I hope I'm not overstepping, but you seem upset. Margaret opened her mouth to dismiss his concern with a practiced lie, but something stopped her. Maybe it was the lateness of the hour, or the wine she'd barely touched, or simply the weight of years of loneliness. Whatever the reason, she found herself speaking honestly. I'm just feeling a bit lonely, I suppose, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Robert's away on business again, and this house, it can feel so empty sometimes. Jason's expression softened, and he took a step closer. I can't imagine how difficult that must be, he said softly. Is there anything I can do? Maybe I could bring you some tea, or we could talk for a while if you'd like some company. The offer, so simple and yet so profound, brought fresh tears to Margaret's eyes. She blinked them back, not wanting to appear more vulnerable than she already had. That's very sweet of you, Jason, she said, managing a watery smile. But I'm sure you have better things to do than listen to an old woman's problems. Jason's response was immediate and earnest. You're not old, Mrs. Sinclair, and there's nothing I'd rather do right now than keep you company, if you'll let me. As Margaret looked into Jason's kind eyes, she felt something shift within her. It was as if a door she'd thought permanently closed had suddenly cracked open, letting in a sliver of light and hope. I'd like that, she said softly, surprising even herself with the admission. As Jason moved to prepare some tea, Margaret felt a mix of emotions wash over her. Guilt, excitement, fear, and something else. A feeling she hadn't experienced in so long she almost couldn't name it. Hope. She knew, in that moment, that she was standing on the precipice of something dangerous, something that could upend her entire world. But as she watched Jason's strong hands carefully arranging teacups on a tray, she realized that for the first time in years, she felt alive. The antique clock continued its relentless ticking, marking the passage of time. But for Margaret Sinclair, it felt as if time had suddenly started moving forward again after years of standing still. Little did she know, this simple act of kindness was about to set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything she thought she knew about love, loyalty, and the true meaning of happiness. As the night deepened and the first tentative conversations began, the seeds of a forbidden love were planted, one that would grow to shake the very foundations of Margaret's gilded cage. The early morning sun filtered through the gauzy curtains of Margaret's bedroom, casting a soft glow across her sleeping form. For the first time in years, a gentle smile played on her lips as she slept. The previous night's conversation with Jason had stretched into the early hours, filled with laughter, shared stories, and a connection that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. As consciousness slowly crept in, Margaret's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, the weight of reality didn't touch her. Then, like a bucket of cold water, guilt washed over her. She sat up abruptly, her heart racing. "What am I doing?" she whispered to herself, running a hand through her tousled hair. But even as she tried to chastise herself, memories of Jason's kind eyes and attentive listening flooded back. The way he'd leaned in when she spoke, genuinely interested in her thoughts and feelings. How he'd made her laugh for the first time in... She couldn't even remember how long. Margaret rose and moved to her vanity, studying her reflection. The woman looking back at her seemed different somehow. There was a spark in her eyes that had been missing for years, a slight flush to her cheeks that spoke of renewed vitality. As she went through her morning routine, Margaret found herself humming softly, a habit long forgotten. She chose a light summer dress, taking more care with her appearance than she had in months. Downstairs, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. Margaret's breath caught as she entered the kitchen to find Jason already there, setting out a breakfast tray. "Good morning, Mrs. Sinclair," he said, his smile warm and slightly shy. "I hope you don't mind. I thought you might appreciate a proper breakfast after our late night." Margaret's heart fluttered. "That's very thoughtful of you, Jason. Thank you." As they sat across from each other, the conversation flowed easily. Margaret found herself opening up about her passion for art, a dream she'd abandoned years ago to support Robert's career. Jason listened intently, asking insightful questions and sharing his own love for photography. "You should pursue it again," Jason said earnestly. "Your eyes light up when you talk about painting. It's beautiful to see." Margaret felt a blush creep up her neck. "Oh, I don't know. It's been so long." "It's never too late," Jason insisted, reaching out to touch her hand briefly. The contact sent a jolt through Margaret, and she pulled back instinctively. "I'm sorry," Jason said quickly, looking mortified. "I didn't mean to overstep." "No, it's all right," Margaret assured him, her voice trembling slightly. This is all very new to me." Their eyes met, and in that moment, the air seemed charged with unspoken possibilities. Margaret knew she was treading on dangerous ground, but she couldn't bring herself to step back from the precipice. The sound of a car pulling up the driveway shattered the moment. Margaret's eyes widened in panic. "Robert," she gasped. "He's home early." Jason sprang into action, quickly clearing away the breakfast dishes. "I'll make myself scarce," he said, but his eyes conveyed a mixture of disappointment and concern. As the front door opened, Margaret smoothed her dress and took a deep breath. Robert strode in, his suit impeccable as always, his phone glued to his ear. "Yes, we'll close the deal by end of week," he was saying, barely glancing at Margaret as he passed. "I don't care what it takes. Make it happen." Margaret felt her heart sink. The warmth and connection she'd experienced with Jason seemed to evaporate in Robert's presence, replaced by the familiar cold emptiness. "Welcome home, dear," she said softly, but Robert was already disappearing into his study, the door closing firmly behind him. Left alone in the suddenly quiet house, Margaret leaned against the kitchen counter, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The guilt was there, yes, but so was a newfound sense of longing, not just for Jason, but for the version of herself she'd glimpsed in his company. As she gazed out the window, she caught sight of Jason in the garden. His shoulders slightly slumped as he went about his work. Their eyes met briefly across the distance, and Margaret felt her heart skip a beat. In that moment, she knew that something had fundamentally shifted. The safe, predictable life she'd known was giving way to uncharted territory. It terrified her. Yes, but it also awakened a part of her she'd thought long dead. As she turned away from the window, Margaret made a decision. She couldn't pursue anything with Jason, but she could reclaim a piece of herself. With determined steps, she made her way to the long-abandoned art room, her fingers itching to hold a paintbrush once more. Little did Margaret know, this small act of self-rediscovery would set in motion a series of events that would test her loyalty, challenge her perceptions of love, and ultimately force her to confront the truth of her own heart. As she squeezed paint onto a palette for the first time in years, the lines between duty and desire, between contentment and true happiness, began to blur in ways she could never have anticipated. The canvas before Margaret came alive with vibrant strokes, her rediscovered passion for painting flourishing with each passing day. Weeks had turned into months, and the art room had become her sanctuary, a place where she could escape the growing tension in her marriage and the conflicting emotions stirred by Jason's presence. On this particular evening, Margaret lost track of time, engrossed in capturing the sunset's golden hues. She didn't hear the car pulling up the driveway, signaling Robert's unexpected early return from a business trip. Robert entered the silent house, his brow furrowed. Something felt off. He loosened his tie, calling out, "Margaret!" No response. As he climbed the stairs, a faint sound caught his attention, soft music drifting from the direction of the old art room. Curious and slightly annoyed, Robert approached quietly. Through the partially open door, he saw Margaret. She was radiant, lost in her work, a soft smile playing on her lips. Robert couldn't remember the last time he'd seen her look so alive. He was about to announce his presence when movement in the corner of the room caught his eye. Jason stepped into view, carrying fresh flowers. "These are beautiful, Mrs. Sinclair," Jason said, his voice warm with admiration as he looked at the painting. "Just like the artist." Robert's breath caught in his throat as he watched Margaret's cheeks flush. She turned to Jason, their eyes meeting with an intensity that sent a chill down Robert's spine. "Thank you, Jason," Margaret replied softly, "for everything. You've brought so much light back into my life." Robert's fists clenched at his sides as he witnessed the undeniable connection between his wife and the young gardener. He expected anger to consume him, but instead, a profound sadness washed over him. When had he stopped seeing Margaret? When had he become so blind to her fading light? As Jason's hand brushed Margaret's arm, lingering just a moment too long, Robert silently retreated. His mind raced, a turbulent mix of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He made his way to his study, closing the door quietly behind him. Slumping into his leather chair, Robert's gaze fell on a framed photo from their early years, Margaret laughing as he twirled her on a beach, both of them carefree and deeply in love. "What happened to us?" he whispered, his voice breaking. For hours, Robert sat in the darkening room, replaying years of neglect and missed opportunities. He thought of canceled date nights, forgotten anniversaries, and the gradual dimming of Margaret's once vibrant spirit. How had he not noticed? As the first light of dawn crept through the windows, Robert made a decision. He wouldn't confront Margaret or Jason, not yet. He needed time to process, to understand, and perhaps to remember how to be the man Margaret had fallen in love with all those years ago. Upstairs, blissfully unaware of the emotional storm brewing beneath the surface, Margaret slept peacefully. Her dreams were a swirl of vivid colors and Jason's gentle smile. But even in sleep, a faint crease of worry marred her brow, a subconscious reminder of the impossible choice looming on the horizon. The Sinclair mansion, once a symbol of their success, now stood as a silent witness to the unraveling of a marriage and the blooming of a forbidden love. As the sun rose, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns, the stage was set for a confrontation that would change all of their lives forever. Little did Margaret know, as she woke to another day of conflicted emotions and secret longing, that her husband now carried a painful awareness of her heart's rebellion. The delicate balance of their world was about to shift, and the tremors would be felt by all. The crisp autumn air carried a hint of approaching winter as Robert Sinclair stood at the edge of his vast estate, watching Jason tend to the garden. The young man's movements were precise, careful, much like the way he had insinuated himself into Margaret's life. Robert thought bitterly. With a deep breath, Robert steeled himself and approached. "Jason," he called out, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. "A word, please." Jason straightened, surprise and a flicker of unease crossing his face. "Of course, Mr. Sinclair. What can I do for you?" Robert led them to a secluded corner of the property, far from the main house and any prying eyes. The tension between them was palpable, hanging in the air like a storm about to break. "I know about you and Margaret," Robert said without preamble, his eyes fixed on Jason's face, searching for any sign of guilt or defiance. Jason paled, his composure cracking for a moment before he regained control. "Mr. Sinclair, it's not what you think. We haven't." Robert held up a hand, silencing him. "I'm not interested in the details, Jason. What I want to know is this. Are your intentions towards my wife genuine, or is this some kind of game to you?" The question caught Jason off guard. He had expected anger, accusations, even threats, but not this calm inquiry that seemed to pierce right through to his soul. Jason faltered, then squared his shoulders. "My feelings for Mrs. Sinclair are real, Mr. Sinclair. More real than anything I've ever felt. But I swear to you we've never acted on them. I would never disrespect your marriage like that." Robert nodded slowly, processing Jason's words. Then, to Jason's utter shock, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a check. $1 million, Robert said, holding out the check. "Take it and disappear from our lives. Start fresh somewhere else, far from here. Far from Margaret." Jason stared at the check, his mind reeling. $1 million, more money than he'd ever dreamed of having. Could change his life entirely. But as he thought of Margaret's smile, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about her art, the gentle vulnerability she'd shown him, He knew no amount of money could replace what they'd found in each other. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sinclair," Jason said softly, stepping back from the offered check. "But I can't take your money. What Margaret and I have, it's not about wealth or status. It's about connection, understanding. Something money can't buy." Robert's hand trembled slightly as he lowered the check. For a moment, Jason thought he saw a flicker of respect in the older man's eyes. "You really do love her, don't you?" Robert asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jason nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I do. But Mr. Sinclair, you should know Margaret loves you. She's torn apart by this. Whatever happiness she's found with me, it's overshadowed by her guilt and her commitment to you." Robert turned away, gazing out over the sprawling grounds of the estate. When he spoke again, his voice was heavy with resignation and a deep, aching sadness. "I've neglected her for years," he admitted. "Buried myself in work, thinking I was providing her with the life she deserved. But I forgot to actually live that life with her." He turned back to Jason, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I won't stand in your way, Jason. But I won't make it easy for you either. If Margaret chooses you, it has to be her decision entirely. Do you understand?" Jason nodded solemnly, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the moment. As Robert walked away, his shoulders slightly slumped, Jason felt the weight of responsibility settling heavily upon him. Inside the house, Margaret stood at the window, having witnessed the exchange from afar. Her heart raced as she tried to imagine what had transpired between the two men in her life. The guilt that had been her constant companion for months now threatened to consume her entirely. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the immaculate lawn, Margaret found herself at a crossroads. The safe, comfortable life she had known for decades stood on one side. On the other, the promise of passion, understanding, and a love that had awakened her soul. The choice before her seemed impossible. But as she watched Robert enter the house, his face etched with a sadness she had never seen before, Margaret knew that the time for indecision had passed. She would have to confront her feelings, her fears, and the two men who held pieces of her heart. Little did she know, the decision she was about to make would set in motion a chain of events that would test the very limits of love, loyalty, and sacrifice. As night fell over the Sinclair estate, the stage was set for a confrontation that would change all of their lives forever. The Hampton sky blazed with the fierce oranges and purples of a late summer sunset as Margaret Sinclair stood on the balcony of her bedroom, her hands gripping the railing so tightly her knuckles turned white. The beauty before her was lost on her troubled mind as she wrestled with the impossible decision that lay ahead. Inside, spread across her king-size bed, were two envelopes. One contained divorce papers, meticulously prepared by Robert's lawyers. The other held a one-way plane ticket to Paris, a dream Margaret had confided to Jason during one of their long, intimate conversations. The events of the past week played through her mind like a surreal movie. Jason's tearful confession of Robert's confrontation and offer. Robert's unexpected vulnerability as he admitted his years of neglect. The raw, honest conversations that followed, laying bare the bones of their marriage and the depth of Margaret's connection with Jason. A soft knock at the door startled her from her reverie. "Margaret!" Robert's voice called softly. "May I come in?" She took a deep breath, steeling herself. "Yes, come in." Robert entered, his usual confident demeanor replaced by a hesitant, almost shy approach. His eyes fell on the envelopes on the bed, and a flicker of pain crossed his face. "I see you've made your decision," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret turned to face him fully, her heart aching at the sight of the man she had loved for so long looking so defeated. "No," she said softly. "I haven't. Robert, I don't know if I can." Robert crossed the room to stand before her, close enough to touch but maintaining a respectful distance. "Margaret, I know I've hurt you. Years of neglect, of putting my work before our marriage. I see that now, and I'm more sorry than I can ever express." Tears welled in Margaret's eyes. "Oh, Robert," she breathed. "But," he continued, his voice gaining strength, "I want you to know that whatever you decide, I will support you. If Jason is truly what your heart wants, I won't stand in your way." The selflessness of his words hit Margaret like a physical blow. This was the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago, kind, understanding, putting her happiness above his own. Before she could respond, another knock came at the door. Jason's voice, tentative and strained, called out, "Mrs. Sinclair? Mr. Sinclair? I need to speak with you both." Margaret and Robert exchanged a look of surprise before Robert called out, "Come in, Jason." Jason entered, his usual confident posture replaced by a nervous energy. His eyes darted between Margaret and Robert, then fell on the envelopes on the bed. He visibly swallowed. I can't do this," Jason said, his voice cracking with emotion. "Mrs. Sinclair, Margaret, I love you, more than I ever thought possible. But I can't be the reason your marriage ends." Margaret felt her world tilting on its axis. "Jason, what are you saying?" Jason's eyes filled with tears as he continued. "I'm leaving. Tonight. I've accepted a job offer in California. It's better this way." "No!" Margaret cried out, taking a step towards him before stopping herself, acutely aware of Robert's presence. Robert, to both Margaret and Jason's shock, spoke up. "Jason, wait. Don't make any rash decisions. Margaret deserves to make this choice for herself." The three of them stood in a tense triangle, the air thick with unspoken emotions. Margaret looked from Robert to Jason, her heart torn between the comfort of her long-standing marriage and the passionate connection she'd found with Jason. In that moment, as if struck by lightning, Margaret realized the truth that had been eluding her. She loved them both in different ways. Robert was her rock, her history, the father of her children. Jason had reawakened her passion, her zest for life, but neither man could be her whole world. "I choose myself," Margaret said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I love you both, in different ways, but I've lost myself in trying to decide between you. I need time. Time to rediscover who I am, what I want." She picked up the plane ticket to Paris. "I'm going to pursue my art, to find myself again. And when I return, maybe then I'll be ready to choose. If either of you still want me." Robert and Jason exchanged a look of mutual understanding and respect. Robert stepped forward, gently taking Margaret's hand. "Take all the time you need," he said softly. "We'll be here." Jason nodded, a bittersweet smile on his face. "Find yourself, Margaret. That's all we ever wanted for you." As Margaret began to pack, her heart both heavy and strangely light, she knew this was just the beginning of her journey. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, she felt truly alive. Outside, the sun finally dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deep purples and blues. As night fell over the Hamptons, three hearts beat with a mixture of pain, hope, and the bittersweet ache of love. The future was unwritten, but one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The Parisian morning light filtered through the gauzy curtains of Margaret's rented apartment in Montmartre, casting a soft glow on her latest canvas. 6 months had passed since she'd left the Hamptons, 6 months of self-discovery, artistic exploration, and deep introspection. Margaret stood back, brush in hand, critically examining her work. The painting before her was a swirl of emotions, bold strokes of passion intertwined with softer hues of comfort and familiarity. It was, she realized with a start, a perfect representation of her heart's struggle. A knock at the door broke her reverie. "Aunt Rez," she called out, expecting her elderly neighbor who often brought her fresh croissants. Instead, she found herself face to face with Robert. "Robert," she gasped, her paintbrush clattering to the floor. "What are you doing here?" He stood in the doorway, looking both out of place and perfectly at home in his tailored suit. His eyes, however, held a vulnerability she'd rarely seen. "I had to see you," he said softly, "to tell you, I'm letting you go." Margaret felt her world tilt. "What?" Robert stepped into the apartment, his gaze taking in the vibrant canvases that covered every available surface. You're flourishing here, Margaret. I can see it in your work, in your eyes. You're alive in a way I haven't seen in years. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded paper. These are the divorce papers. I've already signed them. Margaret's hand trembled as she took the document. Robert, I don't understand. I thought we agreed I'd take time to figure things out. We did. He nodded, a sad smile playing on his lips. And watching you from afar, seeing you rediscover yourself, I realized I've been holding you back. For years. Tears welled in Margaret's eyes. That's not true. You gave me a beautiful life, a family, but not the passion you deserved, Robert interrupted gently. Not the support for your dreams. Jason, he saw that in you, nurtured it in a way I never did. Margaret's heart clenched at the mention of Jason. Have you spoken to him? Robert nodded. He's been taking care of the estate, waiting just like I have been. But Margaret, he's young. He has his whole life ahead of him, and he deserves someone who can give him their whole heart. And you think that's me? Margaret whispered. I think, Robert said carefully, that you need to be free to find out, without the weight of our marriage, without feeling torn between duty and desire. The silence that fell between them was heavy with years of shared history, of love that had transformed but never truly died. Finally, Margaret spoke, her voice thick with emotion. What about you, Robert? What will you do? He smiled, and for a moment, she saw the young man she'd fallen in love with all those years ago. I'm going to try to become the man I should have been all along. The man who supports his wife's dreams, who sees her as a partner, not a possession. Margaret felt a sob rising in her throat. This selfless act of love, this willingness to let her go, it was perhaps the greatest gift Robert had ever given her. She stepped forward, wrapping her arms around him in a tight embrace. Thank you, she whispered against his chest, for everything. As Robert held her, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears, he knew he was doing the right thing, even if it broke his heart. When they finally parted, Margaret felt as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. But with that freedom came a new responsibility, to truly listen to her heart, to make a choice not out of obligation or guilt, but out of genuine love and desire. As Robert turned to leave, he paused at the door. Be happy, Margaret. That's all I've ever wanted for you. The door closed behind him, leaving Margaret alone with her thoughts, her art, and the daunting prospect of a future entirely of her own making. Outside, the bustling streets of Paris continued their eternal dance, oblivious to the profound moment of sacrifice and love that had just transpired in a small Montmartre apartment. As Margaret turned back to her canvas, paintbrush in hand, she knew that the hardest part of her journey still lay ahead. The choice between the comfort of her past and the passion of her present loomed large. But for the first time in years, Margaret felt truly free to follow her heart, wherever it might lead her. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of the Sinclair estate as Jason methodically pruned the rose bushes. His movements were automatic, his mind far away, replaying memories of stolen glances and heartfelt conversations with Margaret. 6 months had passed since she left for Paris, 6 months of tending to a house that felt emptier with each passing day. Jason had thrown himself into his work, transforming the already beautiful gardens into a breathtaking paradise. It was his way of staying connected to Margaret, of honoring the passion she had rekindled in him. A familiar sound broke through his reverie, the crunch of tires on gravel. Jason's heart leapt, then immediately sank as he recognized Robert's car pulling up the driveway. He hadn't seen the older man since his trip to Paris a week ago, and dread filled him at the thought of what news he might bring. Robert emerged from the car, his usual crisp appearance slightly rumpled, a manila envelope tucked under his arm. He spotted Jason and made his way over, his face an unreadable mask. "Jason," Robert nodded in greeting. "Do you have a moment?" "Of course, Mr. Sinclair," Jason replied, setting down his pruning shears. They walked in silence to a nearby bench, the same one where Margaret had first opened up to Jason about her loneliness. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Robert sat heavily, as if the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. "I've signed the divorce papers," he said without preamble, his voice rough with emotion. Jason felt as if the ground had dropped out from beneath him. "Sir, I don't know what to say." "There's nothing to say," Robert replied, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. "It was the right thing to do. Margaret. She deserves to be free to choose her own path." A long moment of silence stretched between them, filled only by the soft rustling of leaves in the evening breeze. Finally, Jason spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Does this mean? Is she coming back?" Robert turned to face him, and Jason was struck by the depth of pain and resignation in the older man's eyes. "I don't know," he admitted. "That's up to her now. But Jason, there's something you need to understand." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "Loving Margaret, it's not easy. She's complex, passionate, with depths that even I never fully understood in all our years together. She needs someone who can match that passion, who can challenge her and support her in equal measure." Jason nodded slowly, a lump forming in his throat. "I know, sir. I've always known that about her. It's part of why I fell in love with her." Robert's expression softened slightly. "I believe you, and that's why I'm here, Jason. To tell you, if Margaret chooses you, you have my blessing." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Jason felt a mix of emotions: gratitude, guilt, hope, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility. "Mr. Sinclair, thank you. But you should know, I told Margaret I was leaving, taking a job in California. I thought it would make things easier for everyone." Robert raised an eyebrow. "And are you leaving?" Jason hesitated, then shook his head. "I couldn't bring myself to do it. The thought of never seeing her again." "I understand," Robert said softly. "More than you know." They sat in companionable silence for a while, two men united in their love for the same woman, each grappling with the possibility of a future without her. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Robert stood. "Whatever happens, Jason, know that I don't blame you. Or Margaret. Sometimes love isn't enough. Or perhaps it's too much." He extended his hand, and Jason stood to shake it, feeling the weight of the moment. "Take care of yourself, Jason," Robert said. "And if Margaret does come back, take care of her too." With that, Robert turned and walked back to his car. Jason watched him drive away, the taillights disappearing into the gathering dusk. Left alone with his thoughts, Jason sank back onto the bench. He pulled out the small velvet box he'd been carrying in his pocket for months, opening it to reveal a simple but elegant engagement ring. As night fell over the Sinclair estate, Jason made a decision. He would wait for Margaret. Whether she returned in a week, a month, or a year, he would be here, nurturing the gardens and his love for her. But if she chose a different path, if she decided to forge a new life away from both him and Robert, he would find the strength to let her go. Because loving Margaret, he realized, meant wanting her happiness above all else, even if that happiness didn't include him. With a deep breath, Jason tucked the ring box away and stood, ready to face whatever the future might hold. The path ahead was uncertain, but his heart was sure. All that remained was for Margaret to make her choice. The Eiffel Tower glittered in the distance as Margaret stood on the balcony of her Parisian apartment, a glass of wine in hand. A year had passed since she'd left the Hamptons, a year of self-discovery, artistic growth, and deep introspection. Her latest exhibition had been a resounding success, her paintings lauded for their raw emotion and technical brilliance. She'd found her voice as an artist, pouring her conflicted heart onto canvas after canvas. But as she gazed at the city of light, Margaret knew it was time to face the decision she'd been avoiding. Inside, her suitcase lay open on the bed, half-packed. Scattered around it were two photographs, one of Robert, dignified and kind, taken on their last anniversary together. The other was of Jason, his youthful face alight with passion as he tended to her favorite roses. Margaret sighed, running her fingers through her hair, now streaked with elegant strands of silver. At 56, she felt more alive and sure of herself than ever before. But the choice before her seemed impossible. A knock at the door startled her from her reverie. "Aunt Rez," she called out, expecting her landlady with the final paperwork for her departure. Instead, she found herself face to face with both Robert and Jason. What are you doing here?" she gasped, her wine glass slipping from her fingers and shattering on the floor. The two men exchanged a glance before Robert spoke. "We couldn't let you make this decision alone, Margaret. It wasn't fair to you." Jason nodded, his eyes filled with a mix of hope and resignation. "We both love you, Mrs. Sinclair, but we realized it's not about us. It's about what you truly want." Margaret felt tears welling in her eyes as she looked between the two men who had shaped her life so profoundly. I don't know what to say." Robert stepped forward, taking her hands in his. "Margaret, this past year, seeing your artwork, hearing about your success, I've never been more proud of you, or more certain that I did the right thing in letting you go." Jason moved to stand beside them, his presence a counterpoint to Robert's steadiness. "And I've realized that loving you means wanting your happiness above all else. Even if that happiness doesn't include me." Margaret felt her heart swell with emotion. The selflessness of these two men, their willingness to put her needs above their own desires, was overwhelming. She took a deep breath, suddenly clear about what she needed to do. "I love you both," she said softly. "Robert, you've been my rock, my partner for so many years. And Jason, you awakened a part of me I thought was long dead." She paused, gathering her courage. "But I've realized something during my time here. I don't need either of you to complete me. I'm whole on my own." Both men nodded, a mixture of pain and understanding in their eyes. "I'm going back to the Hamptons," Margaret continued, "but not to choose between you. I'm going back to open an art school, to share what I've learned, to help others find their voice the way I found mine." She squeezed Robert's hand gently. "Robert, I'll always love you, but our time as husband and wife has passed. I hope we can find a new way to be in each other's lives." Turning to Jason, she cupped his cheek softly. "And Jason, you have your whole life ahead of you. You deserve someone who can give you their whole heart, not just pieces of it." The silence that fell was heavy with emotion, but also with a sense of resolution. Robert was the first to speak. "I'm proud of you, Margaret, and I'll support you in whatever way I can with the school." Jason nodded, a bittersweet smile on his face. "You're going to change lives, Mrs. Sinclair, just like you changed mine." As the three of them stood there, bathed in the soft Parisian twilight, Margaret felt a sense of peace wash over her. The journey ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in years, she was excited about the future. A future she would shape on her own terms. Later that night, as Robert and Jason prepared to return to the States, Margaret finished packing her suitcase. Among her clothes and art supplies, she carefully placed the two photographs, reminders of the love that had shaped her, but no longer defined her. As she zipped the suitcase shut, Margaret caught her reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back at her was strong, confident, and ready to embrace whatever life had in store. With a smile, she turned off the lights and closed the door on her Parisian adventure. Tomorrow would bring a new chapter, one filled with color, passion, and the endless possibilities of a life reclaimed. So, if you haven't subscribed yet, click the subscribe button below and join our community. Based on your interests, we've picked this story for you that's showing on your screen right now. Click to watch it now. We're sure you'll love it. See you next time.